In the summer of 1942, the German Wehrmacht stood at the pinnacle of its power. From the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of North Africa, Hitler's armies seemed unstoppable. The previous year had brought spectacular victories. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Yugoslavia collapsed in 11 days. The Balkans had been conquered with ruthless efficiency. Even the mighty Soviet Union appeared to be crumbling under the weight of Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. But among the German high command, there were those who understood that the campaign in Russia had not gone according to plan. The original strategy called for the destruction of the Red Army within 3 months. Yet winter had arrived with Soviet forces still fighting. The Wehrmacht had failed to capture Moscow. Leningrad remained under siege but unconquered, and the Russian winter of 1941 had delivered the first serious blow to German confidence. Thousands of German soldiers had frozen to death in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Tanks refused to start. Machine guns jammed. Men suffered frostbite so severe that limbs had to be amputated without anesthesia in field hospitals that were little more than frozen tents. Despite these setbacks, Hitler remained convinced that victory was within reach. The Führer believed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. German intelligence reports suggested that Soviet industrial capacity had been devastated by the German advance. The oil fields of the Caucasus beckoned, promising the fuel that Germany desperately needed to continue the war. And there was Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of Hitler's greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin himself. The strategic importance of Stalingrad was significant, but not decisive. The city stretched for 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, a vital transportation artery that carried oil from the Caucasus to the industrial centers of central Russia. Capturing Stalingrad would cut this lifeline and protect the northern flank of German forces driving toward the oil fields. But the symbolic value of the city overshadowed its strategic importance. For Hitler, taking a city named after Stalin would be a propaganda victory of immense proportions. For Stalin, the loss of his namesake city was unthinkable. The German summer offensive of 1942, codenamed Operation Blue, began with promising success. German forces smashed through Soviet defenses and drove deep into the southern Soviet Union. The city of Rostov fell, opening the gateway to the Caucasus. German tanks raced across the open steppes, sometimes advancing 50 miles in a single day. The Red Army appeared to be in full retreat. Hitler, watching the situation maps from his headquarters in East Prussia, grew increasingly confident. He split his forces, sending one army group toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and another, the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus, toward Stalingrad. General Paulus was a professional soldier, meticulous and conscientious, but he lacked the aggressive initiative that characterized some of Germany's more successful commanders. He had served as a staff officer for most of his career, and this would be his first experience commanding an army in major combat operations. The 6th Army was one of the finest fighting forces in the Wehrmacht, consisting of hardened veterans who had fought their way from Poland to the gates of Moscow. These men had confidence born of continuous victory. They had defeated the French, the British, and the Russians in battle after battle. As they approached Stalingrad in August 1942, they had no reason to believe this battle would be any different. The advance toward Stalingrad proceeded rapidly at first. German forces swept aside Soviet resistance, and by late August had reached the outskirts of the city. On August 23rd, German bombers appeared over Stalingrad in massive strength. Over 600 aircraft participated in the raid, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The city, built largely of wood, erupted in flames. Entire neighborhoods vanished in firestorms that created tornadoes of superheated air. Civilians trapped in bomb shelters were suffocated or roasted alive. The Volga itself seemed to catch fire as burning oil spread across its surface. Soviet estimates placed civilian casualties at over 40,000 killed in that single day of bombing. Stalingrad was transformed from a living city into a landscape of ruins, a hellish maze of rubble, twisted metal, and smoking craters. But the destruction of Stalingrad's buildings would prove to be a tactical mistake. The ruins provided perfect defensive positions. Every pile of rubble became a fortress. Every bombed-out building offered hiding places for snipers and machine gun nests. The Germans, trained for mobile warfare on open terrain, now had to fight for every room, every floor, every cellar. The Red Army soldiers defending the city, many of them workers from the city's factories, refused to retreat. Stalin had issued Order Number 227, known as the Not One Step Back Order. Retreat without permission meant execution. Blocking detachments of secret police troops were positioned behind front-line units with orders to shoot anyone who fell back. Soviet soldiers understood they had two choices: fight or die. The German assault on Stalingrad began in earnest in September. Paulus committed his army to house fighting in the ruins. German soldiers, accustomed to sweeping advances across open country, found themselves engaged in a new kind of warfare. Combat took place at ranges measured in meters rather than kilometers. Battles raged for days over control of a single apartment building. The distance between German and Soviet positions was often so small that artillery and air support could not be used without hitting friendly forces. Soldiers fought with rifles, grenades, knives, and sharpened spades in close-quarters combat of savage intensity. One building in particular became infamous as a symbol of Soviet resistance. A four-story apartment building near the central square was defended by a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and a small group of soldiers. For 58 days, this handful of men held off repeated German attacks. They fortified the building by knocking holes through walls to create firing positions and communication routes. They mined the approaches and set up interlocking fields of fire. German soldiers called it Pavlov's house, and it cost them more casualties than the conquest of Paris. Such was the nature of the fighting in Stalingrad. Every strong point had to be reduced by direct assault. There were no flanking maneuvers, no clever tactical bypasses, only frontal attacks into the teeth of determined resistance. The Germans made steady progress, despite horrific losses. By October, they controlled most of the city. Soviet defenders clung to a few pockets along the riverbank, some positions only a few hundred meters deep. German soldiers could see the Volga from their positions. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. But the Red Army continued to fight with ferocious determination. Fresh troops were ferried across the Volga at night under German artillery fire. The crossing was terrifying. Many boats were sunk, spilling their human cargo into the dark waters. But enough men made it across to keep the defense alive. Soviet commanders knew that as long as they held even a small foothold on the western bank, the battle continued. The conditions in Stalingrad defied description. The city had become a wasteland that resembled the surface of the moon. Not a single building remained intact. Streets were buried under mountains of rubble. The stench of death was everywhere. Thousands of corpses lay unburied in no man's land, freezing and thawing with the changing weather. Rats grew fat on the dead and multiplied until they swarmed through the ruins in packs. Soldiers on both sides suffered from dysentery, lice, and a host of diseases. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Food was in short supply. Men fought and died in conditions that would have seemed impossible to endure. Yet the battle continued week after week, month after month. As autumn progressed, a new danger began to manifest itself. The German Sixth Army had advanced so far into Soviet territory that its supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles. Everything the army needed, from ammunition to food to winter clothing, had to be transported by truck or rail across vast distances. The German logistics system, adequate for the mobile campaigns of previous years, was showing signs of strain. Partisan attacks disrupted rail lines. Trucks broke down on primitive roads. Supplies that left Germany took weeks to reach the front, if they arrived at all. The soldiers fighting in Stalingrad began to notice shortages. Ammunition was rationed, food portions shrank, and most ominously, winter clothing failed to arrive. German intelligence had noted Soviet troop movements north and south of Stalingrad. Large formations were assembling in the steppes beyond the German flanks, but these forces were dismissed as lacking offensive capability. After all, the Red Army had been repeatedly defeated in open battle. German commanders assumed any Soviet attack would be easily repulsed. What they failed to appreciate was that the Soviet Union had been rebuilding its military strength. New factories beyond the Ural Mountains were producing thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. A new generation of Soviet commanders, promoted after Stalin's purges of the officer corps, were learning from their defeats. And the Soviet leader himself had finally learned to delegate operational authority to competent military professionals like General Georgy Zhukov. The German flanks north and south of Stalingrad were held not by German troops, but by Allied contingents. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies protected the extended perimeter. These forces were less well equipped than their German counterparts. They had few tanks, insufficient anti-tank weapons, and little artillery. German officers who inspected these positions reported their concerns to higher headquarters, but nothing was done. Hitler refused to divert forces from the assault on Stalingrad. General Paulus requested permission to break off the attack and establish a more defensible winter line, but Hitler insisted the city must be taken completely. On November 19, 1942, as the first heavy snows began to fall, the Soviet trap sprang shut. The Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment designed to cut off and destroy the German Sixth Army. Soviet forces smashed through the Romanian positions north of Stalingrad, then wheeled south. The next day, another Soviet offensive broke through south of the city and drove north. The two pincers met on November 23rd, near the town of Kalach, completing the encirclement. The German Sixth Army, along with portions of the 4th Panzer Army and various supporting units, found itself surrounded. Over 250,000 German and Allied soldiers were trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles across. The initial German reaction was surprisingly calm. Being encircled was not unprecedented on the Eastern Front. German armies had broken through Soviet encirclements before. General Paulus requested permission to break out to the west, while his army still had the strength and mobility to fight its way through the Soviet lines. But Hitler, advised by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air, ordered the Sixth Army to hold its positions. The city must not be abandoned, Hitler declared. The army would be supplied by air until a relief force could break through to restore the situation. The promise of air supply was a fantasy based on gross miscalculation. Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could deliver 300 tons of supplies per day to the encircled army. In reality, the Sixth Army required a minimum of 500 tons daily just to maintain combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport aircraft to deliver even Göring's promised tonnage. The nearest German airfields were over 100 miles from the pocket. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns took a heavy toll on slow-moving transport planes. Winter weather frequently grounded aircraft for days at a time. On good days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver perhaps 100 tons. On most days, far less. Some days, nothing at all. The soldiers trapped in the Kessel, as they called the pocket, began to understand their predicament. Rations were cut in half. then cut again. Horses were slaughtered for meat. The cavalry ate their mounts. Then the artillery horses were killed, which meant the big guns could no longer be moved. Fuel for vehicles ran low. Tanks and trucks were abandoned when they ran out of gasoline. Ammunition was strictly rationed. Artillery batteries were allowed only a handful of shells per day. The wounded could not be evacuated because there were no aircraft to carry them out. They lay in makeshift hospitals, freezing, starving, dying of wounds that in better circumstances would not have been fatal. December brought weather that transformed the pocket into a frozen hell. Temperatures plunged to 20, then 30 degrees below zero. The German soldiers had not received winter uniforms. They wrapped themselves in blankets, newspapers, any material that might provide insulation. Frostbite became epidemic. Men's fingers and toes turned black and died. Ears and noses were lost to the cold. Soldiers huddled together for warmth in dugouts and cellars, burning furniture and debris to keep small fires alive. But fuel was scarce. Many froze to death in their sleep. The Luftwaffe continued its desperate supply effort. Transport planes braved Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and horrific weather to reach the shrinking perimeter. But the loss rate was catastrophic. By January, the Luftwaffe was losing approximately 1 transport aircraft for every 7 tons of supplies delivered. This was an impossible exchange rate. The transport units were being destroyed, and still the supplies that did arrive were woefully inadequate. A single loaf of bread had to be divided among 10 men. Soup was made from melted snow, flavored with a few grains of millet. Outside the pocket, a German relief effort was organized under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders. Manstein assembled a striking force built around the 4th Panzer Army and attempted to fight its way through to Stalingrad. The offensive began on December 12th and initially made good progress. German tanks smashed through Soviet defenses and advanced to within 35 miles of the pocket. Paulus was ordered to prepare a breakout to link up with the relief force, but Hitler simultaneously ordered him not to abandon Stalingrad. Paulus, trained to follow orders, hesitated. He requested clarification. He argued the impossibility of holding Stalingrad while also breaking out. Time was wasted in futile communications with headquarters. The moment passed. Soviet reinforcements arrived and stopped Manstein's advance. The relief force, itself in danger of encirclement, was compelled to retreat. The last chance to save the 6th Army evaporated. Now the men in the pocket knew they were doomed. Some continued to fight because they had no alternative. Others fought because they still believed in their cause. Many fought simply because fighting was all they knew. Discipline began to break down. Soldiers scavenged for food among the dead. Stories circulated of cannibalism, though whether true or the product of starving men's imaginations is unclear. On January 10th, the Red Army launched its final offensive to eliminate the pocket. Soviet artillery, massed in overwhelming strength, pounded the German positions. Infantry followed, pushing the defenders back, compressing the pocket day by day. German resistance was fierce despite starvation and cold. But without ammunition, without fuel, without hope, the outcome was inevitable. By the end of January, the pocket had been split in 2. Paulus and his headquarters occupied the cellar of a ruined department store in the center of Stalingrad. Around them, the remnants of once proud divisions huddled in the ruins. The ruins. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. The gesture was cynical. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than fall into Soviet hands. But on January 31st, Soviet troops reached Paulus's headquarters. The new field marshal surrendered, along with his staff. Over the following days, the remaining German pockets of resistance surrendered one by one. The last German troops laid down their weapons on February 2, 1943. The statistics of the disaster were staggering. Of the approximately 290,000 German and Allied soldiers encircled at Stalingrad, only about 90,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. The rest died of combat wounds, disease, starvation, or cold during the 2 months of encirclement. Of those 90,000 prisoners, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Most died in Soviet captivity within months of surrender, their bodies weakened beyond recovery. Some were held in Soviet labor camps for years. The last prisoners were not released until 1955, more than a decade after the battle ended. The German Sixth Army ceased to exist. 22 divisions, the equivalent of an entire army group, had been destroyed. The Wehrmacht lost hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers, men who could never be replaced. More importantly, Germany lost the aura of invincibility. Stalingrad proved that the German army could be defeated, that Hitler's judgment was fallible, that the tide of war could turn. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad marked a turning point. The victory came at enormous cost. Soviet casualties during the battle and the surrounding operations exceeded 1 million men. The city itself was obliterated. But the Red Army had held, then counterattacked, then destroyed the enemy. Soviet morale soared. Stalin's position as leader was unassailable. The road to Berlin had opened, though it would take more than 2 years of savage fighting to reach the German capital. The battle for Stalingrad represented warfare at its most brutal and unforgiving. It was a collision of ideologies fought in conditions that stripped away all veneer of civilization. Men fought and died in a frozen wasteland of ruins for reasons many of them no longer understood or believed in. The battle consumed armies, destroyed a city, and killed hundreds of thousands of people, both soldiers and civilians. Yet it also demonstrated human endurance under unimaginable conditions. Men on both sides displayed courage, determination, and a capacity for suffering that challenges comprehension. Stalingrad entered history as one of the decisive battles of World War II, the moment when Hitler's conquest of the Soviet Union became impossible, when Nazi Germany's defeat became inevitable. The frozen hell on the Volga devoured Hitler's army, and with it, Germany's hopes of victory in the East. The survivors of Stalingrad, those few who eventually returned home, carried with them memories of horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the destruction of an army and experienced conditions that no human being should have to endure. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was an apocalypse, a glimpse into the darkest possibilities of human conflict, a reminder of what happens when nations commit themselves to total war without limit and without mercy.